Alrighty, hello everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Meta Breakers. I'm JP. I'm joined by Phil.
Guys, you right?
And today it's going to be another sort of fun, for us at least, hopefully for you, philosophical meanderings about the movement phase in Age of Sigmar. So we're going to try and cover, a little bit of the history of the movement phase, how it's changed in the different editions of the game. It's a very important part of the game, and some tips and tricks and things that you can, that we think about when we're leveraging, movement and the movement phase in Age of Sigmar, basically. So hopefully you guys enjoy. Post any questions, etc., or telling us how wrong we are about stuff in the chat. But yeah, I think to start off, actually, Phil, why don't you start us off with I think we both said it, but I think you've said it particularly well a lot of times about how you're like Age of Sigmar is a game about movement, like it is a movement based game. So why don't you take us away a little bit with that?
Yeah, I think when you compare it to its obvious counterpart in 40k, there's a significantly less shooting in AOS than there is in 40k, and significantly less terrain impact in AOS, really. So it's all about movement. People say, you play people all the time and go, oh, should I move this? Should I not move this? And I think for me, very, very, very rare occasions you should not be moving with any unit, unless you've got a unit like Scavengers Ales now that stand still, get a better range. But subject to that, there's no excuse to not to be moving, because you can always be getting into a better position. People who activate in, I know we're talking movement space specifically, but similarly in combat, people I'll just attack with that unit. You kind of go, why are you not using your pile-in move? Like, if you've got the extra tools of movement to set you up and be in a better position, why are you not taking it? Because there's always something you can be doing to get into a better position. Whether that is setting a trap for somebody, whether that is just moving to block the next turn. I mean, the biggest one being as well, how risky and how much you want to roll the dice on the double turn as well. Obviously you've got in that comfort blanket factor in 40k of I go, you go, I go, you go, you're out of range. Whereas in Sigmar, obviously you can decide to play it up against the wall, can't you? And go, right, well, you know what, I'm going to go all out there and I'm going to hope that I get that double turn right on your doorstep. And I'm there. Or even, knowing, for example, that you don't want to charge a unit, but you want to stop your opponent having freedom of running. So, taking a relatively fast-moving chaff unit, something like bats or dire wolves, or kind of something, or griffhounds for Stormcast, and running up to 3.1 inches away and just standing there.
Yeah.
And blocking your opponent on their start lines. Go, right, well, I'm not going to let you kill me, because that would just be crazy. So I'm just going to stand there and ruin your movement phase next turn. It might cost me 100 points, but if that pins you back for that extra turn, do I get 100 points for the value back out of it? Quite probably, because the movement game, right? So if you can tie people down so that they can't move while you then corral the rest of the table, you're creating yourself a really, really, and one of my friends likes to call it scoreboard pressure, aren't you? You're getting yourself up early, and people do make decisions when they're behind on the scoreboard, unless they are really comfortable with how their army works and they're planning to be behind in turns 1 or 2. But yeah, I think you've always got to be leveraging that movement phase, trying to maximize where you can, and particularly now more than ever with in 4th edition, with the advent of things like faction terrain and pieces like that, where they're not stopping you moving right next to them in the movement phase, but then you're triggering off in the combat phase. So I watched a game the other day where someone ran their zombie dragon on the turn to get next to a piece of faction terrain, and then use the pile in to drag the unit next to it into combat because the person hadn't redeployed. So well, there's all sorts of tricks you can use. And faction terrain is probably a whole other debate about whether you should or shouldn't use it and what benefits are involved in it. But there are all kinds of shenanigans in the movement phase, I think, and utilising every opportunity you've got to control the table. And we'll come on to table size in a minute, but using your movement to lock down your opponent's options is massive. I think even with the shooting army, I think you very few ways to make a shooting army work unless you have some kind of mobility in it to block the table out away from distance. And in 4th, probably more than ever, because it's so easy. To slingshot round now with the combat ranges being 3 inches and the fight ranges being 3 inches. It's nigh on impossible with a shooting army to think you're going to keep yourself out of combat past turn 2. In some shape or form, no matter how good you are at blocking. And the best way to do that is to counter their movement with your own movement and kind of move up and just try and sporting analogy, try and tie up the midfield, right, and try and stop getting past your midfield
create
as much
those
as
zones
possible.
of control with your your 3-inch bubbles is definitely part of it. Yeah, James Dean says movement's definitely the meta right now. Yeah, a lot of cavalry foxes for Lumineth. Yeah, we have seen. I think it's cool actually seeing a lot of cavalry because traditionally in Eos it's sometimes struggled. But yeah, we've definitely seen a lot of it, for sure. And
I think it's had a great growth, hasn't it? You've got the ability, but
yeah.
so much light cavalry's been bumped to 3 wounds. You've got had a really,
Yes.
really good
Yeah.
grow up in terms of what we just said there. So using light cavalry in that disruptive role to go and block the midfield.
Yep.
You know what? Actually, the massive difference in 10 wounds to 15 wounds. It's just huge to go right now. I've got a really, really fast blocking unit that's cheap.
Just don't mention Hex Race. Yeah. Too soon.
I'm not sure they're.
Nicholas Moss also says he's loving Seraphon at the moment for the movement shenanigans. That's dope. Yeah, so I mean, movement is also very fun, and it allows you to be creative, sort of like, you know, what you've been saying, Phil. I remember in one of my games, my opponent deep struck down with a bunch of shooting, and then went over to me, and I won priority, and then he was like, "Oh, are you gonna?" I wasn't sure if I should take it or not. I was like, "Okay, I'm gonna take it." And I sort of talked to him, and he was like, "Okay, well, I guess, you know, if you can do enough damage, it's to the shooting that it deep struck down, then, you know, that makes sense to take it." And I actually just moved to 3 inches away in a screen, and then this was in third, so there was no counter charge, but I just stopped 3 inches away, and I was like, right, well, in your next turn, your shooting range is now only your shooting range. You can't move and shoot, and you can't get past this screen. So I was like, I'm just gonna leave them there, and that unit is as good as dead, because it can't, you know, you can't shoot in your next turn. You're just gonna be fighting this small screen of what chaos chariots, and it's like, you know, that was just the movement phase. That didn't, you know, I didn't have to, you know, I would have had to commit a lot of damage to kill all this Stormcast shooting, but I only had to commit 160 points of 2 chariots to just hold it for effectively the rest of the game. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff that you can do.
It's surprising how many people don't think about that kind of. And I know countercharge is new in fourth, right? But I think even the balance of you're giving your opponent the option to countercharge, but CPs a lot in fourth edition, right? So if you can draw out 2 of your opponent's CP to countercharge unit chaff, I still think you're probably ahead in the game.
No, for sure.
So many people look at you surprised and they go, "You're not charging." You're like, "No, I'm just standing 3.1 away, quite happy. Thanks very much."
It works.
You know, and it catches a lot of people out because so many people just think, "Well, just move." I think, and I'm not. I love Sigmar more than Old World because it's so mobile based, right? But so many people play Sigmar in Old World mindset of, "Well, I'm just going to move. I'm going to charge," and they don't. It's getting the fact that as a skirmish game, there's that whole extra layer. You know, we touched before, I think, in shows where no matter what you kill, does it? Like, fundamentally, it's about points, and the points are all scored through movement. You know, so you want to be keeping that movement high at all points in times, and things like, I don't know, as you say, the Nighthaunt have been tweaked recently, which is really good. But one of the reasons they were so powerful is you've got access to things that can retreat and charge.
Yeah.
You've got access to things that can come through. Like your power through is an unbelievable command ability to use. Just maintain that mobility, because again, so many people's lists you see, or people you see play who let themselves get tied down, wonder why they can't score. And you're like, well, you're getting tied down. I was talking to a friend of mine who plays Nurgle the other day. I was toying around with a Nurgle list the other week, and we talk a lot about movement and mobility. I was trying to base it around the flies, because I didn't realise flies had retreat and charge. I was like, well, actually, that fixes up a big thing that switches me off with Nurgle, which is that once you get stuck in combat,
you're there forever.
And he was like, well, I've got all Blight Kings in my list. I was like, I'm much tankier. I'm like, yeah, but once your opponent ties down your Blight Kings, what are you doing? How are you scoring? He was like, oh, I've never thought of it like that before. But that's your issue. You end up in combat, and then you can't score. So
James Dean asks, would you guys say that deep striking is more or less impactful this edition so far? I feel like more armies are taking fast units, so deep striking is less useful, and countercharge as well, which, you know, he says that, it's good that it's 2 CP because it is high risk, high reward. Agreed. But yeah, we were sort of talking about this just before the show, and I think it's, maybe you can answer the hard part of this question, Phil, but I think overall, I think deep striking and fast units have very much changed the shape of the game, and we'll get into this a little bit when we're talking about table size later. But it's you know, there definitely are times where you're like, I've screened everything out, so deep striking is very difficult because I've used my movement 14 horses or, you know, 12 inches in a run to screen this out. So I think I definitely see where you're coming from. But it's just in general, the game has changed quite a lot in terms of how that mobility works, and part of that is stuff like countercharge. And as you said, Phil, you can do stuff like where I had a game where I was in combat with the Nurgle tree, but you know, but so I was like, I'm gonna roll a counter charge because it's guaranteed. It's just move 2d6 plus 3. In fact, you know, like, I mean, you can't always pile away with, but it, you know, there, even if it was my slow Chaos Chosen who are 5-inch move, it's like, well, they moved 5, they ran, and now they've gone 11, or they've moved and they probably haven't moved if I'm countercharging, but you know, or they've countercharged and they're just moving 2d6 in my opponent's turn, or they've just redeployed. And again, not redeployed to escape a charge or something like that, but that's just a d6 move straightforward. You know, if I'm like, okay, you know, like from one of my opponents with Trogs was just redeploying every single turn just to make sure he was getting his Trogs more towards the objective. Because if you're movement 5, then d6 is like 50% extra or more to your movement. Yep. But yeah, so Phil, what are you going to say? Yes or no to deep striking more or less impactful to?
I think it's I'm gonna cheat my answer, right?
Okay.
So I think it's impactful, but I think it's impactful in a different way. So I think what you've seen, what I think I've seen is a drop off in people deep striking in and using that to get into combat.
Sure.
Right? So everyone's now worried about deep striking in, and your opponent redeploys away, and your combat units left hanging in the breeze, and then get smashed in your opponent's turn. Right. So I think from that respect, we've seen a change probably in how deep strike works. But what you have seen a rise of is people deep striking to score battle tactics, dropping in with in a turn advance, ready to do like take the flanks later on, or you've got, you know, Soul Blight now, got loads of options to drop out of terrain with big units that just have big control footprints that can drop in and take objectives, or that can drop in and do battle tactics. Where I think the second part of James' question, I think that the faster units have caused a change when we actually better if we combat units on the table.
Sure.
And we've seen a rise of your hitting units being deployed on the table, your chaff units finding creative ways to appear around the table to score or to block later on, because of things like faction terrain, because of things like countercharge, because of even with redeploy. You know, even in the old days, the old days, it's only like 6 months ago. You know, your chances of, as you say, with your Chaos Chosen, you know, deploy them on the table and redeploy forward in their turn, and then move in your turn and 3d6 charge with your spell, and actually you've got a much better percentage chance of charging going second than you have by deep striking in and trying to roll a 9-inch charge. So you can actually much higher opportunity to charge if you're deploying on the table. So I still think it's impactful, but I think in a completely different way. I don't think deep striking is massive for getting into combat anymore because everyone's worried about redeploy.
Yeah.
I do think there's still a really strong place for it. So we touched before the show, didn't we? I ran my Soul Blight for the first time in 4th at the weekend, and kind of just having 3 units of 10 skeletons dropping out of the grave, just you know, score, take their land, and then set up, take the flanks the turn after, and you know, and just drop onto unguarded objectives was huge. But I wouldn't have used it to get into combat because my faster stuff, the dragons and the wolves, were just much better off starting on the table. So So I still think they're impactful, but not for the same way, is my answer. I don't think they're impactful for combat anymore. I think they're impactful for scoring. And positioning.
And I think maybe to commit to a hard answer, James, I'm not sure if we've answered or not, but I think relative to fast units, I think fast units have gone up in value, and so, you know, relatively speaking, deep striking has maybe gone down then. Because I've definitely seen, as you know, we've all been saying, that like having units that can zoom around as well is really effective. Like I had my Raptorix, I was playing against Trogs, and I was like, I just sort of ran them away so they couldn't get killed by Trogs at the edge of the board, and then it's turn 5, and my opponent's like trying to get the last points out of the game, and I'm like, okay, well, I'm just going to run the Raptorix now back in front of the Trogs, and again, it's like, yeah, you know, you can charge and kill them, but it's going to block him from being able to get on to an objective, or you know, or score, take the flanks, or whatever it was. So it's, you know, I definitely felt like my fast, you know, I was playing Archeon and a bunch of little fast units, but those fast units were really good just because they were so fast. And I think, you know, that also ties in a little bit maybe with there's a little bit of flattening of the damage, and as you were saying, Phil, like cavalry going up to 3 wounds, in some cases it's like you maybe, even if you got good hit, good wound, good rend, etc., you might not, just on a relatively small unit, not have 15 points of damage to kill 5 horses that are 3 wounds each. So even if you hit and wound with everything, you're like, there's still gonna be 1 left, and that means you can't charge next turn or something like that. So that stuff is definitely really, really interesting. So I think we have seen an increase in the value of fast units, as
it's a big glow up. Like I run I run quite heavy cavalry Seraphon, but actually I was punching the numbers the other day, and there's an argument to drop a number of Agrodons, to be honest, and increase the number of Raptidon charges. Being 2 damage on the charge, and obviously taking Beastmaster and making them 14-inch move. It's just you look at it and you have to do a double take yourself when you're moving them, going, I can 14 and still quite happily charge, even without adding run and charge on top of that. And you kind of, I ran that against a regular opponent of mine who plays Skaven, and even caught him, again, Gisele's, you just completely caught him astride. You have Beastmaster and stick run and charge, and suddenly you just happily moving 20 inches and then charging. You go back to, how does a shooting army, probably a subject for a different video actually, but how does a shooting army cope in 4th edition at all? Because any kind of traditional shooting, really, it's quite easy to get to and lock it down with those fast units. So,
for sure. Martin says, BCR Yetis have some nice movement, spoiling your opponent's movement stuff's okay. Yeah, love spoiling my opponent's best plans. James Dean says very helpful. Good. I feel like I talked too long for it to be very helpful. Definitely think there's a learning curve for sure. Yeah, a number of times I've charged a terrain or endless spell, or used power through. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. I've been on both sides of that, where there really are some nice like combos and stuff you can do where you really do set that up, especially also when you're doing things like do not waver, is that what it's called, where 2 you fight none destroyed. You're like, actually I can sort of charge into this endless spell, and use that as free move and also achieve my battle tactic. And
it's one of the reasons why it's so interesting when people talk about manifestations being broken. I hate to use the phrase broken, because you kind of go, well, usually it's just you've not spent enough time tinkering around with it to understand how it works. You early on in this edition, you read so many places of people saying that manifestations weren't working and it was too one-sided. And I mean, I really early on, because I wanted to bit around the edition, I ran Trogs early on, because I was like, you know what, nice and simple, 1 war scroll, happy days. And I played a Luminef list that was based around tech lists that the chap I was playing told me it was utterly broken, and kind of it was designed to abuse manifestations, and all it actually let me do is it let my Trog slingshot off manifestations and drag all those units into combat. And you're like, well, because you're deploying those manifestations, so many people again do it. They go, well, I'll use magical intervention in your turn, I'll drop a spell up front ready to tee up, and you go, brilliant, thanks very much, to my charge phase, I'll charge you and slingshot off it into your unit. And they'll go, oh no, I didn't think about it that way. Or they go, I'll go first to get my spells up early. You go, all right, fair enough, you move forward, get your spell, thanks very much, again I'll slingshot off your spells and use it for the extra movement. And again, it can take people astride, because most armies have a way of getting at least one type of unit, 12 inches plus on movement, and still getting a charge off the end of it. So if you're able to then win that deployment war and make sure you go in second, you're leaving your opponent some really difficult choices. Because again, if they choose, you kind of win-win, right? Because if they choose to sit back out of range, yes, you're going, well, I'm not going to get the charge off in turn 1, but they're not scoring anything, or they're going to cost themselves in 3, 4, and 5 with the battle tactics, quite likely. So it's the fast units are definitely in a really, really good place. Like Cavalry's in a good place, which because we're seeing units taken that people didn't take before.
No, and I mean, for me,
particularly coming into this, particularly coming into this edition, I had a lot of talk, and probably with people looking and obsessing about the combat range going up to 3 inches. I was, it's going to be the age of 40 blocks of infantry just stomping around. We know, at times maybe the design studio do know what they're doing, because actually there's a lot of light cavalry out there. For the edition where we were told there were going to be huge blocks of 40 infantry everywhere. Well, you don't see a lot of huge blocks of 40 infantry, to be fair. So, sorry for talking.
No, absolutely. I was just going to say it's also fun to play fast units, and in some ways more forgiving too. Like I definitely found, again, when I was playing a list of all fast moving things plus unit of 5-inch chosen, it's a lot easier to save your mistakes with your 12-inch Fell Riders than than it is if you've left your chosen slightly out of position. Then you're like, okay, wait, they can't, like, they're 17 away, they can't get away in anywhere. Whereas the Fell Riders, you're like, oh, I need to do take the flanks. You just sort of tape measure 18 inches, and you're like, oh yes, I can do it. You know, anything like that. So it makes it fun. But I think definitely we are still, at least, you know, when I played a couple weeks ago, we're still at a point in the meta where people are not fully dialed in, you know, including myself, like, are not fully dialed into all the stuff you can do with faction terrain, endless spells, power through, all that things. And, you know, the sometimes you can see these real long, the sort of long con of being like, okay, yeah, I'm going to charge in here, I'm going to get a power through, and then in my opponent's turn, I'm going to countercharge into their faction terrain. And you've, like, now had a risk-free play to move, like, 25 inches across the board, and probably most of the time destroy their faction terrain for free. You know, like, if it's anything, even reasonably weak units can often kill them. So it's it's definitely a very real thing at the moment. So Big Tom is saying, played a Stonehorn at the weekend, charged Gluttons at one hand. Stonehorn did 2d6 fly to the other end, but 2.9 inches away. Oh, and meant he couldn't pile in towards the Gluttons. Yeah. So there's pile-ins is almost it's been somewhat simplified with the 3 inches stuff, but that's traditionally been as sort of, Phil, as you mentioned, like, sometimes people will roll, will just be like, I'll do combat, I don't need to pile in, and it's like, actually, there's a lot you can do with those 3-inch pile-ins, you know, especially when there's multiple units in combat. You know, you can be like, okay, I'm going to pile in here, and now you've sort of closed the door, so something that hasn't fought yet can't get through to where it wanted to, or, you know, I think in this example, Big Tom saying where it's like, oh, suddenly now the unit that you're closest to is a unit you didn't want to fight. You know, you were like, oh, I wanted to pile in towards the closest, you know, unit that was in the Gluttons, but now the closest unit is the Stonehorn. And, you know,
well, it's interesting, isn't it? In fourth, you can still pick. I think so. I think what Tom said. You can pick the further unit and go towards it, but you can't pull it. So in third, you could pull yourself out of combat. So you could have chucked the Stonehorn over there, piled away, left the Stonehorn out of combat. Happy days. Whereas now you've got, if you're in 2.9, you have to stay within 2.9. I think the biggest issue then with the bigger units comes with coherency, right? So you can still daisy chain, but you're then taking a massive risk.
If you lose one model,
if they break it, suddenly you're just picking off 20 guys. You know, sugar. Which I think is interesting as well. I think that, again, the coherency rules have been tweaked, and I think, again, when you look, there's times you walk past casual games or you walk past club games, you go, I'm not sure everyone's playing coherency exactly how it's written, to be fair, because it is a big change.
Yeah.
I mean, I saw a picture. I saw a mate's game the other day. He sent me a picture of his game, and he was bemoaning he'd charged his Blood Knights wrong. And he had them spread across, and I was like, but you've got 8 Blood Knights in a single file line. I was like, I think sure you were breaking coherency anywhere at this point. I hadn't even thought about it. I was like, it's a big thing, right? You're tucking back in and again, leaving those, blocking those movement corridors and keeping those movement corridors where they should be. And I think, again, people don't necessarily always appreciate it until they are playing with one eye on it, to be fair. You know, again, talking to people about kind of, you kind of reminding people, you know, your model can't fly, so it's all right. You can't just be lifting it over the units. You're going around, and people are like, oh, don't be picky. I'm not being picky. There's a difference of like 3 inches of movement there. Like, So it's just playing it kind of how it's written. But yeah, coherency adds to that. So, but I think piling's really good in that it's been far quicker, but you still have options. You still have really good options to do things if you use it. But I think, like I said, there's so many people just don't use it.
Yeah.
Just automatically, particularly when they're in the heat of like 3 or 4, and then it's like I'm just into the mode of rolling dice.
Yeah.
So like I'll roll the dice. You kind of go, do you want to pile in? And they're like, no, I'm just rolling the dice. And then a turn later, like, oh, I wish I'd piled in because I'm just out of range. Like, well, exactly. Like, where's that unit going when it's finished my unit? Even when they're playing, where are you planning to go after you finish my unit off? There's got to be a way of getting nearer to it.
Yeah. No, yeah, for sure. Exactly. Like, especially, I think, people get a big, if people get a big block of infantry and everything can attack, they often forget about piling in. But it's especially with those big blocks of infantry where it's like, well, are there any auras, right? Do you have any heroes who you're gonna want to buff like your unit next turn or something like that? And so it's just it's as you say. I mean, it's hard, right? I understand why. Like, if you're like, I've gotten to the event, I haven't really practiced my list, so I'm like focusing on the fundamentals, which of course makes sense. But like, in theory, you should always be like, right, well, I'm doing, like almost like a snooker player or whatever, but you're like, I'm doing this, but next turn, eventually I want my guys to be on this objective, so I'm just going to take 3 inches of movement, or, maybe you can't go the full 3 towards the objective, but you're like, 1 or 2 inches towards the thing. Everyone's been there where you're like, okay, now I've changed from automatically getting onto the objective to being anything except for a 2 to run is on the objective, and now you got to spend, 40 minutes on your chess clock thinking about whether you're going to spend a CP or risk the 3 up.
You see so many people who there's that famous nursery rhyme, isn't there? The Duke of York, up the hill and down the hill and up the hill and down the hill, and they do, and they move one way, and then they turn after they're moving back again, and you go, well, why did you do that? You've just like, I mean, I played a chap in an event recently who Cities of Sigmar, and he was significantly slower than my army. He got his 3d6 charge up on his hammers, and he moved them up, and he was ready to charge, and he rolled the charge, and he buffed everything ready to go, got the charge off, and then went, oh, if I take that charge, I've come out of all my buffs from all my heroes, so I'm not going to charge now. And I'm like, but you now sat right in front of my entire army, like your whole plan was to get this charge off, and then you just sat there, and my entire army just counter-charged into them and cleared them off. And you're like, well, but if you weren't going to charge, you should have just sat way back there. Like, you had no need to do that. But that indecision and that not, like you say, not having a clear plan of, is that unit doing after this?
Yeah. No, 100%. I think also it's something that we've talked about before in general, is just like, you're going to want to really look at those early game moves, because a lot of the times, like, you can make a couple of moves in literally your first turn of the game that can really compromise your chances of winning. As you say, you can, where sometimes, you look back on the game and you're like, well, there's nothing I could have done, because like I couldn't charge because I wasn't in range of my buffs, and then and then I got charged, and then all my main guys died, and now I lost. And it's like, yeah, well, it's because of that, that one first move you did. And it's often, setting yourself up right in turn one. That's sort of, I guess, the overarching strategy of the game, is where you're thinking, how am I going to win? And that should really dictate your first moves about, like, I think what you want to avoid is a reasonably common mistake, is where you move just sort of generically forward, because you're like, I don't want to stand still, because that feels like I'm not doing anything. And I don't want to, like, run everything way close to you, because that's dangerous. So you just sort of move a little bit forward, putting yourself in a risk range, but also not in a structured way that leaves you with a plan. So I would say, as advice, insofar as I'm allowed to give it, is like, either you're moving, if you do want to just move forward for board control, which is often a good idea, what I will often do is I'll take, like, my screens, and I'll move them as far as they can go. So my screens are now, 6-7 inches away from the enemy, and my good stuff has moved up, but it's, 12 inches away. So my opponent is somewhat limited in being forced to charge the screens, or not being able to move particularly far past them before they charge. And then, I've managed to get a better position with my good units without just leaving them all, out in the wind to get charged. But I think, again, there's sort of, I would say, almost 2 parts to Age of Sigmar. Well, to lots of games, but to Age of Sigmar, where in the early game, you're often navigating, like, a strategic plan, where you're like, right, I want to get up and I want to get a good engagement, and you're sort of thinking about, where you're moving and how you're pressuring your opponent in a high level way. And then there's, like, the later part of the game where there's no plan at all, because everything's, so many dice have been rolled, and you've realized that your rules didn't work how you thought they did, and you find out your opponent has run in charge. And then that's where you're doing different sort of movement shenanigans, where you're like, well, I need some desperate way to get on an objective. Okay, I can charge into this screen and then power through, for example. But, like, I think, those are sort of almost 2 separate skill sets, I would say, in terms of, like, how are you moving, how are you controlling the board, and then how are you moving when you're with that micro,
I think also part is how, and I think we touch on it every time about knowing your own list inside and out, right? So you can concentrate on your opponent. Is how can you use your movement manipulate your opponent? So, can you use those fast troops to do something they weren't expecting, that then they end up in that, the Duke of York example, but they end up in that indecision of going, well, I didn't expect him to do that. Like I was expecting
Yeah.
I was going to move forward. I thought he'd move forward, and I worked out that I was going to have the bonus on the charge. So that, and you suddenly do something completely off the wall. So I ran Zinch against a huge block of Skaven, like the typical Skaven castle with loads of artillery, but he was really slow and he was central. I put my sort of fastest troops, I guess, in the thirds, and actually put my horrors on the flanks, right, quite slow. But then bomb burst all my fast troops out to the flank and left him with just one unit of pinks in the middle. Flank stuff got swamped and wiped pretty much straight away because there was a lot of change on both flanks as well. Didn't know what to do, and the result he just ended up walking up the middle. And in turn 4, he literally said to me, he was like, nothing I can do now because your army's just literally surrounding me. I was like, yeah, because all you did was walk up the middle. And I'd kind of thought, well, you've got all your power in the middle.
Yeah.
As I went to the flanks, he just didn't know what to do other than go and do like seize the centre and just ended up getting fully surrounded. So, can you use your fast troops? I mean, one of my favourite sayings, I think I've used it a couple of times to you, JP, maybe to you viewers as well, but speed will get you into and out of a lot of trouble in this game. Do you know what I mean? So can you use your speed to get your opponent to make a mistake? Because if you then have the speed to exploit that mistake and they don't have the speed to correct that mistake, well, it's a slippery slope, isn't it? And it is, although the scoring is very balanced in Sigmar, if you can start that landslide, and it can just snowball, because we talked at times ourselves, and one of the biggest challenges as a player is to try and keep out your own head and not get drawn into the fact that something's starting to slip, and suddenly you make one mistake leads to 2, 3, 4, doesn't it? And can you use your movement to do that without even having to take any units out particularly, but just getting them, what on earth is he planning with that unit?
Well, absolutely.
Before you know it, they're guessing themselves.
Yeah, I mean, also it goes with it again. If someone, your opponent, especially in the early turns of the game, is like, right, I know your army, I know my army, I'm gonna try and slowly move up into the middle of the board, and then we're gonna duke it out, and I'm gonna win because my units are more efficient than his. And then if you can do something, you're like, right, well, I'm gonna get a chaff unit, that charges into another chaff unit, and then I manage to get a sneaky little pile in that tags something big, but it's not enough to kill the unit. Then maybe their whole plan is now changed. If they're a good player, obviously they're going to be like, okay, cool, he's done this, and like now I'll adapt to it. I'm going to use that pile in to not overcommit to killing that unit, but I'm going to use that pile in to just try and move mainly 3 inches straight forward, something like that. Obviously there's counterplay, but as you say, suddenly they're under a different sort of pressure where they're like, oh wait, I didn't expect to be fighting, or maybe then they're like, okay, do I chase this fast unit that could technically, maybe these 5 cavalry could go kill one of my heroes that I don't want in combat and has never been in combat, where you're there looking up your war scroll, you're like, wait, what does a Chaos Sorcerer Lord hit on? I should not be in this part of the app.
It's a good way as well of if to give people helpful advice as well. If you go into events and stuff, it's a good way, particularly in the early rounds, of sizing up what type of opponent you're playing, right? So if you can do something off the, and you can, you're not so much watching the tape, you're watching what's your opponent's reaction, like do they look thrown by it? Because if they do, to your point, good players will know how to take things in their stride, and you can gauge quite quickly then what measure, because that's a key part of a tournament play. And I get kind of like, for you guys in nations teams and stuff, you kind of all know each other, and you kind of know it's Bob, and I know what Bob does, and etc. But when you're like a normal player and you turn up to an event, key part is sizing up who you're playing, isn't it? Do you know if this person is a relatively skilled tournament player? Are they brand new? Are they how do you size out on a table? Clearly you kind of have the standard chat, don't you, at the start of the round that goes,
charge them turn 1, find out what sort of man they are, man or woman they are.
Yes, Mr. Archeon. But so those are a bit more risk averse. But you can see, does it throw them, does it not throw them, and kind of you can get the measure of people quite quickly, I think. And
no, for sure.
All of that kind of bluff and I think we were talking in the pre-show about just don't get that in 40k. You can't afford to. You just get shot off the table.
Yeah.
So there's much more bluff and double bluffing movement for Sigmar. Any other Games Workshop game, to be honest, and it's one of the reasons why I think it's one of the better games they've got, because it is, you're there, right? The fundamental 2 things you want to be doing in as a gamer is you want to be moving your models and rolling dice. That's what you want to be doing. So you're still you're not rolling dice. What was the point in turning up?
No, absolutely. So, but I mean, I agree. I think that's what Age of Sigmar, I think now is a good time to talk about the table size, but especially you know, when I started playing and the table was bigger, it was a very big fun part of the game was that you'd have two players, you know, sometimes 22 inches apart, and you'd be like, right, well, we both move 8, so neither of us can charge each other turn 1. So now we're all gonna be, you know, moving, you know, a little bit to sort of get, you know, get the threat on them before they can get the threat on us, as well as, you know, considering stuff like the double turn existing and all these things. So, you know, I think the movement phase is really, if you are a new player or you're a practicing player or you're trying to get better, I think the movement phase, well, not just the movement phase, how you move your models is often going to be a huge factor. You know, like I had one of my games where with Archeon, where Archeon was dead and a bunch of other stuff was dead, and I was like, well, luckily for the last 2 turns I've run my Sorcerer Lord into the middle of the table because now he can do whatever it was he did. I think actually he just charged some trogs to stop them from moving, countercharged some trogs just to stop them from moving, and you know that's good. You know, it's not a traditionally good use of the Sorcerer Lord, but you know once the Chosen are miles away because they've been charging and Archeon's dead, you know, there's not a lot he's buffing, so it's like he is another one of your pieces. You know, I've definitely seen some people who are like, I have a unit that I used as a screen or a small hero, and they're just like, right, well, you know, that's my small hero, he lives at the back of the board. And it's like, well, that's good, you know, for turns 1, 2, 3 maybe, but like after that he's often just another piece you have that can take the flanks, that can do you know, do not waver if he can charge enemy faction terrain. You know, if you've got Scragrot who's been teleporting himself up the table all game, then you can be like, yeah, I'm going to charge the faction terrain. It's not going to kill him. There's no bad guys left because they're all fighting in the middle. And like all of your pieces, if you're moving them every turn with a plan, can score you points, which at the end of the day, you know, so points mean prizes. Big Tom says, great point. Sometimes I double people with Archeon Chosen. My man. And even some people's heads goes, yeah, even before I've done the first turn. Yeah, absolutely. It's hard because they know, right? They know they're up against it, you know? And to be fair, actually, everyone I played against when I played Archeon and Chosen and I got the double, they were completely calm about it. And, they, you know, I think a lot of them did a good job of being like, right, I'm about to be in a very difficult situation. What points can I get? You know, and so they did that well. But for sure, you know, I mean, there's some opponents who can be rather unfun to play against because as soon as you roll anything on your dice that's above a 4, they're like, ugh. And you see them roll their eyes. And, you know, I get both feelings. Where one, I get the negative feeling of like, there's going to be a long 3 hours and I'm probably going to have to like look after my opponent's mental well-being to make sure that, you know, it's not too bad for them. But the flip side is I'm like, great. Like, if you're someone who gets upset when your opponent gets lucky, then it probably means you're not thinking about, you know, tactically thinking about the game. And so, no, absolutely. That's
because the game's very rarely decided on. And like it catches me so many times where, you know, people will endlessly tell you, I lost this game because of dice, I lost that game because of dice, and like one of the best bits of advice I ever got was from Luke, who told me that never ever accept that as an answer and always find the real reason why you lost the game. And you know what? Ever since he gave me that piece of advice, I've always managed to find something on every single game. One of them, I'm not going to lie, took me a good 5 weeks to get over myself and like, how on earth did I lose it? But to your earlier point, when I finally worked back through it all, was deployment, and I worked out there was 2 units I should have deployed further back and would have made a complete difference to the first 2 turns. There is always something. You can have good rolls and bad rolls, but there is always something you could have done differently.
Yeah.
When you truly analyze it, and if you go in with that mindset approach, it's such a good learning curve. Such a good learning curve to get your head around what you could and should have done.
Absolutely.
For absolute sure.
I remember I've told you, Phil, this story before, maybe told chat, but unfortunately they can't stop me from saying it. But it was I had a game, and you know, I talked to Luke with my list, and he was like, right, your list is really good, you're going to beat everybody except for this one guy, don't get drawn into this one guy, right? And then of course I draw that guy, right? And so already I'm like, oh well, that's unlucky. And then he has his incarnate back when they were better, and he makes like a 6-inch charge into my front line, which I expected, and then he's like, oh, I'm not really happy with that, and just re-rolls it into a 12, right? Gets all the way over everything into my Chaos Sorcerer Lord again and kills my Chaos Sorcerer Lord, and I'm like, right, you know, I wasn't particularly like tilted, I was still trying to play the game, but I was like, in my head I was like, right, well, it's a bad matchup and this has gone wrong, like, it's over, like, whatever, I'm gonna play for points. And then, we played out the game and it was perfectly fine. And then at the end of it, I was like, okay, what's the score? And, and he beat me 25-24. And I was like, there is definitely about 18 different things I could have done to get 2 points out of that game, but just, and I wasn't even, it was funny because I wasn't even like head down, like, oh, I've lost particularly. I was like playing, but it was just, in retrospect, I was like, yeah, I taken my foot off the pedal completely. I wasn't trying to eke out every single point. I was just trying to go through the motions, maybe I'm going to get a 12-inch charge as well, and then I'll be in a winning, but like, yeah, absolutely. It's off the topic of the movement phase, but the mental movements I made were definitely incorrect. But yeah, I mean, I guess I tie it in by saying he flustered me by rolling a 12-inch charge. So you can also try that against your opponents. It's a great way to move your cron spine around. So yeah, brief. We've danced around it, but I think it's a fun thing to talk about. Is about how do you feel? You go first, Phil. About the table going from the big table to the littler table.
So I'm like you. I wasn't happy about it. I'm not going to lie. So I because I've always enjoyed playing faster armies. It was a good having the extra space was obviously helpful for pulling your opponent's army into places it didn't want to be, or to corralling space into, or bringing to bear concentrated force where they didn't want it to be. So I think it was one of those things where it was probably almost, it's not game driven. I think that's one of the things I struggle with, right? So I would like to think that, like any hobby, you're rewarded for the years you put into it with seeing a return for that, and a kind of a rising skill level. You would like to think, if you play and pay attention, that therefore that gets rewarded through the game. Unfortunately, commercially that doesn't necessarily work the best from a Games Workshop perspective. So I think the fact it wasn't game driven, I think, frustrated me, because it was mainly driven by what's the average, what's the traditional size of a dining room table. There was a big push for it, because obviously Games Workshops, fair enough to them, they're a business, they want to make the game accessible to everybody. So how do you make the game more accessible? You tell them, well, instead of having to have a 6x4 piece of MDF, you just need a dining room table, so you no longer need to go to war with your missus. You can actually we've got a dining room table, so I can play on the dining room table. So from that perspective, it made sense. But I also think there were lots of people clamoring for it, because I do think that newer players, and for people who do like maybe more static armies, obviously they're going, well, I can't reach people. Well, you kind of go, well, you're playing a static army, what do you expect? But that doesn't sell models, and it doesn't pitch those armies, does it? So I think there's a reduced skill cap with it. I think with everything. Well, so not reduced. That's wrong from what we talked about. To be fair, it's my worry was my worry was it would be a reduced skill cap. I think the reality is it's changed where the skills are needed. So you can still absolutely pull people out of shape with movement now. You just have to do it in a very different way, how you did it previously with the bigger tables. So I guess the drop off and the end result wasn't as bad as I feared it might be. Just like anything, isn't it? To be fair, if you're committed to playing AOS, Old World, 40k, you've got to accept. The rules change, and therefore you've got to adapt with them and move with them. And we're all now doing things slightly different in fourth that we would have sworn by in third. And it was just one of those, really. So initially I wasn't overly keen.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it's changed, isn't it? We've all got to roll with it and move forward, I guess. So
no, I agree with that. I think the same as you. I preferred the older, bigger table, and I think what as what you've said is just true. You're like, okay, we lost a little bit of skill expression in the movement phase, and we've transferred. I mean, there's a bunch of new stuff now, right? Like you can, when I watch really good players play, they're sort of sitting there going, right, I can stop my opponent from doing any battle tactics after turn 3 because I know which ones they have, and they've already done these two. So and there's definitely loads of ways to skillfully express yourself in the game. It's just, sort of maybe my favorite one got a little bit smaller. But as you say, also, I wouldn't want the game to stay exactly the same for 5 years. So you got to accept that, over time, the stuff that you exactly like is going to, wax and wane. And I mean, for me, at the end of the day, like, so much of what I like about Warhammer is external even to the game, where I'm like, I love going to a weekend away with all the boys, talking about Warhammer for 3 days straight, and moving around the models and rolling the dice and painting the models and all that. And then so I'm like, the rules make this table can be 12 by 12 inches, and I'll be like, the game is suddenly a lot harder, but I still had a great weekend. So I definitely think that's true. But it did, I think it did definitely have an effect on the way that movement has been played. And I think it'd be very interesting now because loads more armies have speed or run and charge or teleports and all that stuff. There's been a lot of power creep, so it would be interesting to see what the game would be like now if it was a bigger table or with further apart objectives.
I think as long as they keep the balance as well, I think going forward, and with there is an element of balance has become striking a balance between you want every race to have a fair shot at winning games. You also need to remember people collect races because they're different to other races. So you don't want to sacrifice variety on the altar of balance. And there is a danger, once everything can just reach everything.
Yes, that movement.
Actually, then you almost end up in a point. Well, we might as well just deploy touching each other and just roll dice because if everything can reach where and not going too far down that route of everything can reach everything. But I think we're probably balanced about right at the moment. I think it's just like I say. Sometimes you hear the balance mantra and you kind of go, we do want armies to have flavour. We do want armies to be different. I want to know that if I'm collecting Gloomspite Gits, it's probably because I want a comical approach to warfare. If I'm collecting slaves, it's probably because I want to be the evil bad guys. And it should play like that. They shouldn't just play the same way with different figures. And I think as long as we keep that flavour, then we're all And to be fair, I think when you look at kind of the Skaven Battle Tome and you look at kind of what we're hearing about the Stormcast Battle Tome, then they are striking that balance, right? Because those two are definitely not playing anywhere near the same way, which is a good thing, right? For sure.
No, I agree. I think that's definitely. I know we've touched on it before. It's like we do want to not sacrifice too much for balance and preserve some of because like I think it's funny that for Slaves to Darkness, you could so interchangeably, what we've seen in the meta is change out Varangard and Chosen, where you're like, one of them is, 12-inch or 10-inch move cavalry, and the other is 5-inch move guys, and you're just like, well, yeah, of course I'd rather be 10-inch move, but at the end of the day, I can get pretty much anywhere I want to go with 5-inch. It's like turn one, it makes a big difference, and after that, everything's fighting. Like, so I definitely think there's a little bit of that has been lost, but again, it's also an index hammer sort of situation, and we're gonna see a bunch of new books, and I'm sure Lumineth will come out and they'll get speed of double hish or something, and they'll move 4 times as fast now instead of 2 and all that stuff. But it's so far I've had, as I said, having lots of little fast units in my slaves list felt very fun. So
yes, it's more enjoyable.
Yeah, for sure. So, I think that's covered more or less everything I wanted to talk about with regards to movement.
That's it. I'm sure you said how much you wanted to tell folks you loved Redeploy.
Oh, Redeploy. Yeah. Okay. So
how fan you are of new Redeploy.
So, I really didn't like old Redeploy. I still sort of don't like new Redeploy just because it's D6. That is the one thing I feel like it could just be 3 or 3 plus D3 or something like that, because I just hate rolling a 1. When my opponent rolls a 6, it's upsetting, but mentally I think that's what you're preparing for a lot. Your opponent's like, I'm going to redeploy, and you're like, it's probably a 6, and then they roll a 6 and you're like, of course, I knew it, that's fine, and you're happy for them, because you're a beautiful and wonderful opponent, so you're like, oh, that's great, I wished you a 6. I'll give you a 6. Just say it's a 6. But when I spend a CP in this, in this economy on Redeploy and I roll a 1, I'm just like, I don't know what it is actually that bothers. Because I feel like if you spend 2 CP on a counter charge and you fail it, that's perfectly fine. But for some reason, 1 inch, you also have to move your models, but it's like annoying to move your models only 1 inch. I'm just saying, I just wish it was.
You get 40 infantry.
Yeah, exactly. Make it. D3 plus 1. Then you can never roll a 1. Or D3 plus 3.
I like the Jeopardy. And to be honest, I'm a little bit more, say, fair with it than you. Like when I roll a 1, I just have to go like, do you know what? Every time, and it feels. Every time you roll a 1, it feels like every time you just roll a 1. But you know what? It's gonna be a 1, and then anything after that is a nice present.
Well,
roll the 3.
Big Tom, yeah, redeploy is ace. Imagine a command ability for plus d6 to charge. Yeah, that's what you can use it to close the gap. Yeah, it's also when you use it to escape a charge, it's like half your opponent's charge. Of course, for me, it's just +1 to charge. That's the issue. That's the command ability that's +1 to charge, or -1 to your opponents. But yeah, so we'll close on that. That I think redeploy should be 3 inches. Or 3 plus D3 at worst. But 3, everybody would just love to move 3 inches. You just make redeploy like a pile-in. You know, you're just like, okay, you know, at the end of your opponent's move phase, you can like reconsolidate 3 inches. Just
where's the fun? You're too old. You've lost your sense.
I know.
Of, you know,
I know. I'm far too old for this game. They made it fancy. All right. Well, let's turn off the YouTubes then. Sorry, everybody. But no, thank you everybody for coming in and chatting and all that good stuff. Hope you enjoyed us talking about the movement phase. Hope maybe you learned something, and just remember to move all your models and at least pretend you have a plan. That's how's everyone else doing in Meta Breakers? Asked James Dean. Well, Luke is sort of on a sort of TTS main hiatus from Warhammer because he played so many events last year that he's sort of taking a break for a little bit this year. I know Fabian's also sort of taking a break roughly for the same reasons. Like there was a lot of prep for Worlds. So like a lot of events, a lot of teams events, a lot of grinding, you know, what's the meta, all this. So I think for them, they've sort of, you know, they're taking a break. They'll be back. Everyone always ends up coming back. And I know for Phil, he's got, you know, stuff going on. It's still not necessarily easy even after anything else like that. And I'm sure at some point he'll probably want to make a video or something like that to talk about that more in depth. But I know Luke also wants to come back and do some stuff on the channel. We just sort of haven't really organized it, and he probably next time we do, you know, a video that's a bit more accurately on, you know, maybe like a deep dive into a particular army, maybe even slaves. I know Luke's been playing a lot of slaves, so he might come in and he'll be able to give a much more in-depth analysis of, you know, like the actual state of the meta right there out on the tabletop. As long as you're playing in Russian TTS tournaments, that'll be very useful for you. But yeah, so that's more or less the update. But yeah, you know, on that, we want to thank everybody for supporting the channel, all the patrons who are supporting the Patreon. It makes a big difference. I know it makes Phil feel very loved out there. So, but yeah, thanks a lot. Again, you can expect more content from me and Phil out here, and then, you know, as the other boys come crawling back to Warhammer, as everyone eventually does, we'll be getting them back on the channel as well.
Definitely.
But yeah, so that's bye from me.
And bye from me. Thanks for sticking with us, folks.
Yeah, everybody have a good night. See ya.